Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pathways to Prosperity 2023 virtual workshop series titled Newcomers and Racialized Experiences in the Canadian Labor Market, Challenges and Opportunities. We are delighted that you have chosen to spend your time with us and are confident that our speakers will provide you with good insights. My name is Mohammed Almi from the Diversity Institute, based at the recently renamed Toronto Metropolitan University. As we get started, this webinar is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space. I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. We ask that if that is the case, you acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. I'd like to acknowledge that this land we're on is in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Indeed, Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd like to thank the organizers of this series, Pathway to Prosperity. We have two presentations today. The first is titled Newcomers, Skills in the Canadian Labor Market, Challenges and Opportunity, which is presented by Dr. Wendy Sukier and Dr. Guangying Mo. The second presentation is Exploring Systemic Barriers Facing Precariously Employed Racialized Edmontonians, Preliminary Findings, presented by Drs. Jennifer Long, Dr. Dorian Intugane, and Dr. Helen Guattari. Before I pass it on to Drs. Wendy Sukier and Guangying Mo for today's first session, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. This webinar will be posted on the P2P website for future use. Please feel free to share it and promote it. There will be time for questions and answers towards the end of today's event. If you'd like to submit a question during the session, please enter it into the chat and to the Q&A feature in your platform, and I'll make sure to pass it on to the right individual. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute, Dr. Wendy Sukier, to start the first presentation.
Thanks so much, Mohammed, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. So we have a slide presentation, and my colleague, Dr. Mo, will kick us off.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about, the overall status of labor shortages in Canada, and then we'll, focus more on immigrants' employment issues and look at their employment outcomes, and then we will discuss more about, how we're going to solve this issue and provide the way forward, as our suggestions. So Dr. Wendy Sukier is the academic director and founder of the Diversity Institute. I am currently the director of research working with Wendy and Mohammed. So our research institute was founded in 1999, and right now we have about 130 full-time researchers and staff working on a variety of topics relevant to diversity, inclusion, and equity. And in addition to that, we have a large network of industry and community partners, who are all doing their work in this landscape to promote EDI in their worlds. And then we have, we have a lot of support from the government, from research funding agencies, etc. So right now we have a little bit more than $30 million in funding over 4 years. And then we're very much committed to social justice, but we're grounded in the business case for diversity and inclusion. So this is something we really want to emphasize on, because you will see in our presentation is very much based on research, but the focus is more about how to apply research in the real world to solve the problems. And we also have 7 incubation projects and sponsor several others through different teams. And one of our research method has been named as the best practice by UN Prime. So let's look at the issue of labor shortage. We all know small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada is a big component in the economy. Actually, we call that SMEs, or medium and small and medium enterprises. They provide 90% of employment in the private sector. So we could see, those small and medium-sized enterprises are actually making a huge contribution to the economy. However, they are very much challenged by labor shortages. So the data is from the 4th quarter of 2022 in Statistics Canada survey on business conditions. And then we can see the pattern is very clear that all SMEs are very much challenged with retention, with recruitment, and they're all reporting labor shortages. Next slide, please, Wendy. And then if you look at the breakdown of industries, and we could see that there are some differences across different industries, but overall, 36% of Canadian business report labor shortages at various skill levels. And on top of the bar charts, and you could see accommodation and food services, retail trade, and manufacturing. These are the 3 industries that are having most acute issues with labor shortage. And then, 61% of those reporting recruitment and retention challenges, they talk about the obstacles are worse compared to the data that StatsCan collected 1 year ago. And so if we think about immigrants' role in the economy, right, we all know that immigrants is taking a huge proportion in the national population. And this is the data from Statistics Canada. And then they looked at the data from 1871 until now, and then they combine all the data sources they have to look at the number of immigrants and the proportion of immigrants in the national population. So all the blue bars, those are number of immigrants. And so we could see there's a steady increase, but in terms of the proportion of immigrants in national population, we could see there was a spike earlier on in the, in the beginning of the 20th century. And now we're exceeding that historical, spike of 22.3%. So this year, the proportion is 23%. So about 1 out of 4 people in Canada are immigrants. And then the projected data show that the proportion will continue to increase gradually to, more than 30% in 2041. So that means in 2041, about 1 out of 3 Canadians are immigrants. So that shows that immigrants are taking a large proportion in the labor force. However, right, immigrants are not necessarily employed. So this is the data that we used to look further down to the differences across ethnic groups. So overall, Statistics Canada, they conducted a comparative study to look at a range of 12 years to look at employment issues related to immigrants. Overall, they found new immigrants are more likely to be unemployed. So that data is not shown in this graph, but I'll tell you the number. So for new immigrants who landed in 5 years, the unemployment rate is 9.6%. For those who landed between 5 to 10 years, the unemployment is 6.2. And for those who stayed here longer than 10 years, the unemployment rate is 5.6%. So it's clear that new immigrants are most frustrated with this issue of unemployment. But if we look at ethnicity, right, it's across different groups, there are huge differences. So overall, the darker blue dotted line from the bottom, that is the Canadian born population, and we could see the unemployment rate is pretty steady. But then different ethnic groups are having different situations. Overall, immigrants from Africa are most challenged with unemployment issue. And the Filipinos and immigrants from Europe, they are having a better situation. But it's all relevant to the immigration policy. Okay, so this graph is like similar, right, to talk about education relevant to unemployment. So the latest data this last year, 2022, showed that unemployment rate of the age population from 25 to 54 for immigrants is 8%, but for Canadian born is 5%. So the gap is very clear. It's significantly different. In 2016, only 38% of immigrants held jobs commensurate with their education. So they were hired, right, based on their education level. However, a lot of the immigrants experience discrimination during that whole process. There are some research that found foreign sounding last name are having less opportunities to get interviews with large organizations, right? And then 30% of them are having less opportunities with smaller and medium-sized enterprises. So this pattern is also observed across regulated and unregulated professionals. Okay, so that does not necessarily mean that immigrants are less educated. So we found the data in 2021. So this is labor force survey data. We found that if we look at those employed immigrants, actually they overall have a higher level of education. So if you look at the darker pink slice and the light blue slice, so those are people with bachelor's degrees and master's or higher degrees, right? We could see the proportion of immigrants with higher, university and higher degrees are having a larger proportion compared to Canadian borns. Yes, so this one is looking at unemployment for more than 12 months. And if we look at this, it's very interesting to see that again, those unemployed, for immigrants also have a higher proportion of university degree and with master's or higher degree compared to Canadian born. So what that means is that, immigrants, they're overall highly educated compared to Canadian born, but in the labor market, it's also very clear that they are suffering from short-term and long-term unemployment. Okay. And here's another study that's comparing Canada to Australia, and we found that the 6 key occupations, nursing, medicine, engineering, education, dentistry, and accounting. So those are like, very highly respected, occupations in the society. Immigrants in Canada, they are earning less than immigrants in Australia. And also in STEM occupations, right? So those are the sectors that the government is putting in a lot of attention and trying to promote economy, counting on STEM occupations. And we see that 44% of all STEM educated adults in Canada are immigrants, so slightly less than half. And 72% of PhDs in engineering are immigrants. 68% of PhDs in computer science are immigrants. So we do see immigrants are getting a lot of education in this sector. However, less than 50% of immigrants with these degrees, they work in non-STEM occupations. So it's a huge waste of talent. And then also compared to the United States, in Canada, only 20% work in non-STEM occupations requiring a university degree, compared to US, the number is 48%. And also compared to the United States, it's very hard to say this, but our immigrant workers in STEM occupations, they earned less than their Canadian-born counterparts, right? But in the United States, STEM educated immigrants, they actually earn more than their US-born peers. And so we could see that is relevant to innovation, right? If we're not supporting or promoting new immigrants, it's going to damage the potential force coming from innovation. And this is the data from Conference Board. And then so what they found is that overall the 844,000 Canadians who face learning recognition challenges stand to gain $16,000 and $20,000 per year should their education or skills be recognized. So what that means is that the unrecognized education and skills in Canada translate to between $13.4 billion and $17 billion in lost earnings. So the consequence could be losing the global competition for talent. Only 21% of university-educated newcomers believe immigrants' credentials and experiences are recognized. Slightly less than 1/3 of those, newcomers believe they have fair opportunity in the Canadian job market. And among a representative sample of 18 to 34-year-old new Canadians, 30% indicated they're likely to leave Canada within the next 2 years. And then we also have data showing that a 40% decline in citizenship uptake 2021 versus 2001. And actually the 2021 census data showed that about 45.7% of immigrants that they're leaving Canada in the coming 2 years. So employment is relevant to a lot of issues, not only income, but also relevant to newcomers' health and well-being. So those are all huge social issues relevant to the economy. So I'm going to pass it to Wendy.
Thanks so much, Mo. And I think a lot of this you probably have seen before, but it is important to, in my view, to really be aware, if you're interested in employment, of what employers' perspectives are on these issues. And we recently had a roundtable at Metropolis where it became very, very clear that a lot of immigrant serving organizations don't understand employers. They think that employers should give immigrants jobs because there's a moral imperative to do so. And that's just not the way business works. And it most certainly isn't the way small and medium enterprises work post-COVID, where most of them are struggling to survive. And that was a message that came through loud and clear. So one of the things that we think is critically important is to take a hard, cold look at what settlement service providers and other agencies that are engaged in training and employment activities do. And we did a review of about 400 different programs, and probably won't be a surprise to everyone in the room. What we found was most of them had no connection with employers. And that's why we talk about training people for imaginary jobs, because there actually are some really egregious examples of training programs where an agency gets funding for personal support workers and takes Afghan physicians and leads them to believe that taking a training program for personal support workers will help them practice medicine in Canada. Or bridging programs that lead nowhere, because so often for regulated professions, you don't just need the training and to pass the exams, you need the placements. And so if agencies involved in training are not directly and closely working with employers, effectively they are training people for imaginary jobs. And we've, there are a lot of issues that were identified in the study. Some of it doesn't apply broadly. It's, some settlement agencies and employment services are doing a fantastic job of really tailoring and targeting programs to specific populations with strong wraparound supports and commitments to inclusion. But that is not always the case. And so that's something that we need to really highlight. The other thing that we see is a lot of fragmentation and competition. And some of this is a result of funding sources and behaviors. The funders do not incentivize collaboration. And so you can find multiple, entrepreneurship 101 for immigrant programs across the country, but lots of things that don't exist for people to actually help them establish businesses, for example. And so there's a lot that really needs to be teased out. We also see that there's a real limitation of the amount of evaluation and accountability. Often people report on how many people took their program, whether they liked the program, but relatively few report on whether they got employment, how long that employment lasted, and whether it was good employment. We've seen examples. We were running a specialized training program to help people transition into jobs, digital skills. And one of the streams was for Salesforce, which is a very in-demand application, lots of unfilled jobs. And a couple of the people in the program came up to me to chat and said they had master's degrees in computer science from Pakistan, and the settlement agency put them in a inventory, basically put them in a program to learn how to stock shelves in a warehouse because that was the program that they had. And so, there is a lot of what I would call predatory behavior that we have to figure out how to address. And if the agencies and organizations work together more closely, so whatever door you come in, if there isn't a program at that particular organization, you get referred to the organization that does offer the program, we would do much better. And we also know from research we did on immigrants that their experiences are negatively related to their level of employment. So the more education a newcomer has, the less satisfied they are with what they get from settlement agencies. We also know that there are programs that are developed for newcomers that are not taught by newcomers. They're taught by people who have no understanding of the role of trauma or cultural differences, et cetera, et cetera. And we also know that much of the English and French language training in this country simply does not work. And the Auditor General of Ontario published a very damning report that suggested that the LINK programs in the province, most of them did not produce better results than driving Uber would have. And so one of the things we're really questioning is how we teach languages and the extent to which we can look at innovative models using technology, working with employers, and so on, as opposed to the conventional approach, which is sit in a classroom for X months. The other thing that we've uncovered is in some, there are some professional occupational training programs, for example, that require grade 10 English. And in the province of Ontario, a lot of the school boards have the contracts for running the LINK programs. And this is the process they use. Oh, you need grade 10 English. That's great. So first you do grade 5 English, then you do grade 6 English, then you do grade 7 English, then you do grade 8 English, Then you do grade 9 English. And once you pass grade 9 English, you can do grade 10 English, as opposed to having competency-based approaches where you really clearly identify what is required to meet the grade 10 competency level, or even what is required to do the job and work backwards. So this is one of my most horrifying things. 33% of students with 800 hours of instruction progress by an average of 1 benchmark. And so, it's bad. The other thing that we feel very strongly is that entrepreneurship is often not considered a legitimate pathway by many of the settlement agencies, sometimes because they don't really understand it. And for sure, some newcomers get pushed into entrepreneurship, self-employment, and so on, because they're excluded from conventional employment. But we also know that many immigrants choose to be entrepreneurs and would prefer to be entrepreneurs as opposed to work for someone else. And in some communities, if you look at the South Asian community, for instance, the propensity to entrepreneurship is equally divided between men and women. So it's very important that we recognize that entrepreneurship is legitimate and we have the appropriate supports for people who want to be entrepreneurs. And we also think about entrepreneurship not just as a pathway to owning a business, but also as a very powerful form of experiential learning where people can do stuff where they feel like they're being useful. They can learn English, they can learn financial literacy, they can learn cultural competencies and develop all sorts of skills that will serve them well, even if they go to work for another employer. And we also know that, of course, COVID created huge challenges, many of which led organizations offering training and support to go on the internet, but internet access is often a huge challenge for people in low income. We found that during COVID, 42% of racialized kids in Toronto, many of whom are children of newcomers, 42% of them were doing homework on a smartphone because they did not have access to computers and high-speed internet. So this is not just an issue in rural and remote communities. So at the Future Skills Center, one of the things we're trying to do is develop a systems-wide approach that really looks at the entire ecosystem. And I'm always willing to insult absolutely everybody and critique absolutely everybody. So as we said, employers are looking for skills in all the wrong places. For sure, we need to create more inclusive employment practices, and that's something we're working on. Certainly, there are skills that many newcomers to Canada need to better develop. And of course, we're supporting work on that. But the intermediaries, the service providers and the funders of the service providers also need to innovate. And they need to innovate in their understanding of what the skills are that are high in demand. People talk about digital skills. Sometimes they don't actually know what that entails. And what we found is, of course, there's demand for computer scientists and engineers and so on, but there's also demand for people with just basic digital skills. In fact, in the province of Ontario, when you unpack what employers mean in the private sector when they say they want digital skills, only 10% are talking about deep technology skills. About 15% are talking about middleware skills, being able to use SQL and so on. 75% just want Excel and Microsoft Office. Essential skills, now branded as Skill for Success, obviously important, and easy, not easy, clearly defined, and we have the tools we need to assess them. The tools we need to develop them are another question, and there's lots of work being done there. Wraparound supports and understanding the nature of career paths for me is super important. And I'm on the committee of one of the committees of the Labor Market Information Center, and well-meaning people. We will give people information. We will give them information about where the jobs are. And if we give them information, they will be able to get the jobs. It's not how it works. You know, learning is a social process. And when you're dealing with some populations, especially those that have experienced trauma and anti-Black racism and distrust institutions and have not had good experiences with learning, whether in their home country or in Canada, you really have to think about the stages of getting people into the training and how you support them at every step of the way. We know that having access to subway tokens in Toronto can make the difference between whether somebody participates or not. Having access to childcare can make a difference as well. And as I said, you know, we're very committed to focusing on employers and making sure that they understand the assets that newcomers bring, as well as the ways in which they can more effectively engage them. I don't have time to go into these in a lot of detail, but I just highlight some of the programs that the Future Skills Center and others are offering. I mentioned the Advanced Digital and Professional Training Program, short reskilling in a matter of months, coupled with work integrated learning. And for newcomers, in my experience, work integrated learning is one of the most powerful tools to create opportunities. We have a whole range of different programs focused on creating pathways for newcomers. And as I said, we really think that entrepreneurship is an important area to consider. The further upstream you can start, the better. We're looking at adapting our free tutoring program, Study Buddy, for Afghan refugees in a partnership with the Peel Board of Education, because obviously if people don't get through high school, they're not going to have good chances at employment. And there are lots and lots of other programs that folks are developing across the country. Many of the sectoral councils, many of the chambers of commerce have very specific and targeted programs, but what they need are the partnerships with settlement agencies. And even within the federal government, they're starting to open up the doors to newcomers with work integrated learning opportunities that will help them develop their skills. We're very committed to Magnet as a platform to link the pieces together, and happy to talk about that more. And at the end of the day, from our perspective, if you want to engage employers, and in fact, if you want to engage Canadians, making sure that people understand that immigrants drive economic success and innovation in multiple ways is absolutely fundamental. So thank you very much, and I will pass it back to the boss.
Thank you very much. You actually gave us 5 extra minutes, Wendy, which is a perfect timing. I will then give it to
and very unusual, I will add.
Yes, in this case, I will give it to Jennifer to get it started. Thank you.
And thank you so much to PTP and for everyone here today for giving us the opportunity to speak on a very important topic. I will share my screen, and together I'll present first, followed by my colleagues whom I will introduce in just a moment. And so let me just share my screen here. Okay. And so we want to thank the P2P team for having us all here today. My name is Dr. Jennifer Long, and I'm here with Dr. Dorianne Intungane and Helen Gutteri from MacEwan University in Edmonton, Alberta. We're going to begin with a territorial land acknowledgement because we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather in Treaty 6 territory is in the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. With this acknowledgement and with the work that my colleagues and I do here in Treaty 6 territory, we are attempting to honor and remain mindful of the ongoing collective work that needs to be done as treaty people, and our responsibility to this past, our shared presence, and to one another in the future. And so today, our team is going to be presenting on exploring systemic barriers facing precariously employed racialized Edmontonians, preliminary findings. You'll hear from all three of us in this presentation today. We have one final colleague, Dr. Rita Dengal, who works at the University of the Fraser Valley, who is unable to join us today, but who has been important and tantamount to completing this work successfully. So our interdisciplinary research team is working with the City of Edmonton's community social workers to conduct mixed methods research that explores systemic barriers facing racialized individuals who are searching for work, accessing social and settlement services, and experiencing exclusion in the workplace. You can see our definition of systemic barriers here, which focuses on patterns of behavior, policies, and practices within organizations that perpetuate disadvantage for racialized persons. This research began back in 2019 and transitioned online due to the pandemic. Therefore, we added the question, how does or did the pandemic affect racialized job seekers and employees, to our overarching research goal of exploring the labor market barriers facing racialized job seekers and employees living in Edmonton. Before we go further, we wanted to quickly address terminology. And so we use racialized persons as a category to describe someone who is identified by others or who is self-identifies as someone who is non-white in the Canadian context. We acknowledge this is a socially constructed identity that is most often based on one's skin color, but can also be based on one's accent, beliefs or practices, place of origin, among other characteristics. Anti-Black racism became another important concept due to the nature of our findings that we're showcasing in this presentation. And we use the Black Health Alliance's definition of anti-Black racism, which are those policies and practices rooted in Canadian institutions, enforced through everyday practice that strengthen beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and/or discrimination towards people of Black African descent. Our context is different from the previous two speakers. Of the 1.1 million individuals living in Edmonton, approximately 330,000 are racialized individuals, and 1 in 4 is an immigrant. In 2020, the CBC reported on the annual wage rates among Edmontonians disaggregated for racialized identity. And as you can see here, Black men and women living in Edmonton and Calgary made significantly less money than their non-Black counterparts. It was also reported that Black women and men in Calgary and Edmonton were between 1.5 to 2 times more likely to be unemployed than the rest of the population. Thus, there is documented evidence that Black Edmontonians face systemic racism in the labor market here. Like many medium-sized CMAs, Edmonton lacks affordable housing and childcare. A recent settlement and integration report for the City of Edmonton found that newcomers continued to experience racism and a lack of recognition of their credentials, as we just heard from the previous reports, from the previous presentations as well. Further, they struggled to find meaningful employment, navigate the bureaucracy of Edmonton services, or make social connections with other Edmontonians. These findings align with the literature concerning racialized experiences of employment across Canada, and again, as we've just heard in the other presentations. And in our data, we also found evidence of employment and role segregation of racialized individuals, as well. Our participants were not hired due to their lack of Canadian experience. For today's presentation, we're using intersectional theory from Kausick and Walsh. These authors use Kimberlé Crenshaw's work on intersectionality to argue for the need to explore the ways systemic racism works beyond what the authors call the big 3 factors. Now, these big 3 factors are sexism, racism, and classism. In response to Kausick and Walsh, we hope to examine the intersections involving multiple categories of difference to explore how anti-Black racism and these other intersections of exclusion impact our racialized participants in their search for employment or their experiences in the workplace. In this presentation, I'm going to present themes, the first part of this presentation in any case. I'll present themes from our focus groups held both virtually and in person with racialized individuals living in Edmonton. We hired community connectors to populate these focus groups who were identified by our community partners. And where possible, we hired community members to transcribe those focus groups held in other languages. Of these 7 focus groups we conducted, I'll present data from 6 sessions with a total of 28 participants. Here, it's important to note that most of our participants were 1st or 2nd generation immigrants. We assume that some of the insights we're describing here today would be relevant to the experiences of those longstanding Black Canadians living in Edmonton. However, we recognize that both the categories of racialized newcomer and racialized Edmontonians have heterogeneous experiences, and that the experiences showcased here might not be representative of all racialized individuals living in Edmonton. So in what follows, I'm going to present on 3 intersections of Black individuals' experiences of employment, followed by 2 important themes that were revealed in our analysis. This will be followed by Dr. Doriane Intungane, who will present our findings from a previous stage of the research regarding service providers that we thought would be of interest to our audience today. So as you can see here in our first quote on the left, a Black Francophone female participant described how her certifications were questioned because of the racist beliefs that African immigrants could not possibly be educated. She and other participants believe that this was because of the stereotypes held by white Canadians about African nations and Africa as a continent. These experiences align with Gillian Crease's work in Vancouver, which documented a widespread ignorance about Africa and its diversity, and the generally pejorative assumptions and images of crisis and despair held by non-African Canadians. Crease also notes the long history of discourses about Blackness, which include negative stereotypes embedded in racist assumptions about intellectual inferiority. In the second quote, you see a Black Muslim participant speaks about the lack of religious accommodation and resulting layoffs of one Edmonton-based employer. This is significant due to the ability of employers to get around accommodations protected by the Alberta Human Rights Act. And we return to this discussion of policy and practice again in a future slide. This experience of the Black Muslim participant aligns with Zaini and Mabido's recent work on Black African youths in Calgary. And the authors found that it was difficult for their participants to access the labor market when their names were perceived to be too difficult to pronounce, or when related to, in their study, African, Arab, or Muslim identities. This demonstrates that it is no longer about one's credentials, but one's name that becomes a primary identity marker in navigating the labor market. The final intersection of anti-Black racism here on the right is the bias towards accents or Francophones living in the Anglophone environment of Edmonton. Here, our Black female participant highlighted the fact that everyone had an accent, but that it is certain accents from African countries that were deemed unacceptable. You don't have the rest of this quote here, but she continues on to say, the English you take in Africa, Nigerian English, Ghanaian English, and Liberian English, they're not the same accent. So when you come to talk about accent to someone, I don't know what they're looking for. The reasoning behind accent bias has been studied by Crease and Wiebe, who argue that racialized individuals are seen to lack what they call embodied cultural capital, and that these perceived limitations are, quote, central to the descaling and downward occupational mobility of racialized individuals living and working in Canada. So overall, our analysis showcased the amorphous nature of the labor market exclusion as it was associated with various stereotypes and biases. Another example, which is not showcased on this slide here, but which I will read for you, is from a Black Francophone woman who said, are our resumes unsuccessful because they think we're from Africa, or they assume we're Black or Muslim? The problem is generally, you can't be sure because this kind of racism is not expressed overtly. So it's hard to say whether I'm being excluded, this is the person who's speaking, because I'm Black or Muslim or some other kind of identity. This amorphous nature of exclusion helps us better understand how intersecting disadvantages may compound and feature in an employer's decision to hire or not racialized individuals living in Edmonton. We connected this theme with what many of our respondents spoke about as the lack of communication of white Canadians to discuss issues tinged with prospective racism or racial themes. As you can see here in this quote, this participant spoke about a lack of communication regarding the end of her contract. Despite going to her coordinator and HR, she said that she felt like she was in a vacuum, that there was no communication about the end of her position. Upon hearing this, I think some might argue that this could just be an example of poor communication within the school environment. And this is the employment context here. This was a job or teaching contract. But there were many examples from our data where Black Canadians and newcomers experienced being left out of the loop, where administrators or managers did not take the lead or follow up with incidents when they occurred. This all added to what respondents state here at the beginning part there, the unlivable reception and atmosphere of their job, of their workplaces. We researchers believe that the lack of willingness to address issues as they surface in employment or in the institution belies Canada's cultural convention of taking a colorblind approach to addressing racialized exclusion. Colorblind racism is an idea that, we'll define it here for you, is the idea that ignoring or overlooking racial or ethnic differences would somehow promote racial harmony. Anti-racism experts, of course, have argued that taking a colorblind approach has the opposite result, and that those folks who enjoy racial privilege are actually ignoring the experiences of those who experience racism. In addition to asking participants about their experiences trying to find work and working in Edmonton, we also asked them questions about their pandemic experience. And it's clear that COVID ended up deepening the existing exclusions felt by Black Canadians, which has been supported by recent job data disaggregated for racial identity. The first quote you see here by a Black Muslim participant showcases the "because of COVID" excuse that was used to let Black employees go, regardless of their tenure at the institution. Others, respondents, spoke about white employees holding on to their jobs for longer or being asked back to work sooner than their Black coworkers. The second quote highlights how Black Muslim participants felt as though their potential employers believed their racial or perhaps religious identity made them more likely to catch and spread the virus. This again might harken back to the anti-Black stereotypes that we talked about in an earlier slide. And the final quote that you see here sheds light on the role of anti-Black racism in the gig economy. This final participant describes the lack of available side jobs to help make ends meet that ultimately affected their bottom line to be able to survive the pandemic. So these data align with the evidence of other studies regarding the experiences of Black Canadians and newcomers and the impact of the pandemic on their employment. And this focus on COVID experiences is another intersection we wanted to explore to help us uncover the ways in which racialized newcomers and Edmontonians are experiencing structural barriers to the labor market. So I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Doriane Ntungane, who's going to provide a brief overview of a previous data collection phase that involved interviewing service providers in Edmonton about the questions covered so far in our presentation. Doriane?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So we wanted to talk to employment service providers because they offer a variety of services to anyone looking for a job, including racialized people here in Edmonton. So we wanted to understand if there are any strategies or practices that they use to help racialized people facing discrimination in the labor market and how they help them to integrate the labor market here in Edmonton. And we want also to ask if there are some recommendations in terms of policies or strategies that can be used here to ensure a diverse workplace in Canadian companies and institutions. We talked to 9 employment service providers and research institutions focusing on research on anti-racism and anti-oppression operating in Edmonton. So each of these agency here has at least 15 years of experience for working with racialized people and job seekers here in Edmonton. And then some of the agencies are targeted service providers, so they provide services to a specific group of individuals. So they help newcomers or immigrants, for example. There are other institutions that are universal service providers, meaning that they offer services to anyone without a specific group identity or category. So they help the youth, adult people, newcomers, or Canadian-born residents here. But then some other agencies here, they are mixed service providers. So they provide a mix of both targeted and universal services or programs. So what we heard from them is that they all recognize or acknowledge the challenges of Edmontonian newcomers and immigrants in their search for employment. But then only 3 of them, 3 of the employment service providers have specific programs or strategies that they use to help racialize workers. So mainly because most of these agencies, they don't collect data based on racial identities of anybody who is asking for a service. So some of the strategies here focus on helping employers and educating hiring team members to provide, they do provide anti-racism training to companies, and then they also support those who are willing to actually change, include more diversity in their companies, to actually design a program that is probably tailored to the needs of the company. Another strategy that they use is to have open conversations with employers about hiring racialized job seekers. They recognize that some of the hiring team members, they just don't have enough information about the skills that the immigrants have, or the racialized people have. So they do this type of educative conversation, and that has been helpful. In terms of helping the racialized job seekers, they have teaching programs that teach job seekers about the Canadian workplace culture. They share as much information as possible about existing supports that exist for new immigrants, to anyone looking for a job. And these agencies, they do have different type of mentorship programs, and they organize networking events, as well as providing language lessons. When we ask about policies, what type of policy should be implemented, or what can be changed, they all agree that there is no immediate need for policy change. So based on their experiences, they have noticed that sometimes a policy change can do more harm than help, because hiring team members will just have to follow the rules without really understanding why they have to follow certain requirements. So they found that it's much more helpful to raise awareness, explain to companies and hiring teams the benefits of having a diverse workplace. And they also recommend having some sort of keeping Canadian companies more accountable through auditing, counting for diversity and inclusion of the workplace. So they imagine that most of these companies nowadays, they are aware of the importance of diversity, but then some of them have started to collect data, but then the system did not necessarily change. So they are more afraid that this can be just a trend and there is no deep change in the long run. So I think now I'm going to pass to my colleague, Dr. Ellen Gatteri, who is going to continue with the recommendations that we have so far.
Yeah, thank you, Dorian, and thank you, Jennifer. Can you all hear me? Okay. So some of the recommendations from our research study are that some of our participants recommended that we need more funding towards Francophone services to integrate Francophone immigrants. And this was based on the data that we collected in Edmonton. There were very, very few Francophone social service organizations that support Francophone population to integrate into the Canadian labor market. And the other recommendation that was recommended in our participants is based on our data is that they felt that most white Canadian, they didn't understand or did not accept immigrant or the process of immigration. And one of our respondents spoke about their experience with white Canadians who always questioned their being here in Canada. For example, she said they asked, why did you come here? And they didn't realize that there is an immigration process that accepts people to come here as economic immigrants. So what they're saying is that I think most white Canadians need to be educated that people come here legally, they are not illegal. And there is a process that is followed, or they're expected to follow through the immigration process. So participants also felt that it's very, very, very significant for immigrants to be supported in their integration in the workplace through shadowing and mentorship programs so that they can get integrated into the Canadian labor market. And there's also a need for more social integration into a settlement program to support new immigrants integrate into the Canadian workforce. So our next phase of the research that is on the way is an online survey that we have started. So we have administered online survey, and we are hoping to collect data with 400 participants. And the other stage is to develop the design sprint, which will be a half-day workshop. And we are hoping to learn from our research finding and identify possible recommendation for our community partners. So in summary, our racialized participants' experience of exclusion, as noted by my colleague, is based on the stereotypes that are rooted in anti-Black racism, which also exclude them from participation in the Canadian workforce. And there's also a need of white Canadians failing to understand that, racialized immigrants come here through a legal immigration process. And there's need for education that this is a proper immigration process that people come here in. And education of anti-Black racism is very, very, very significant to demystify this racial stereotype. The other thing is that we have also presented the way the pandemic also deepened the inequalities that existed in workplaces and in education, as most of our participants felt that the pandemic was used as an exclusion in employment for people who are racialized Canadian. Our research with service provider also showcases that many did not have specific programs that addressed racialization and the experiences or the experiences of racialization in workplaces. Thank you.
And so I think that ends our presentation. Thank you very much to Dr. Ntungane and Giteri. If you have any questions about our work here in Edmonton, Alberta, please don't hesitate to contact us and reach out to us. We have our emails here. And again, I think I'll give it back to Dr. Elmi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And it's a wonderful panel when we end on time and everybody's keeping to the schedule. So that's great. There are some questions that were posed in the chat. I noticed some of them were answered throughout, but they were directed to all panelists, so I might be repeating some. I'll start with the open questions right now. In terms of what about elder newcomers? They do not attend to school, and most employers in small cities lack resources to educate new hires. So that question could be both directed to Wendy and Mo, or Jennifer, Dorian, and Helen. So Jennifer, should I throw that off to you first to get us started?
Sure, thank you so much. And so this is in part of one of our recommendations, that not just newcomers receive opportunities for mentoring or shadowing, which again is a positive way to go about trying to have, learn the ropes and to craft bigger social networks, etc. But also we were thinking of mentoring in terms of what you could do in volunteer capacities, etc. So this is something that I think I like the idea of elder newcomers instead of a terminology I've used in the past, which is old comers, which again, not good. So I think this idea of mentoring and bridging in for volunteer spaces or employment spaces, depending on the type of service, I think it can be bridged out to have that capacity as well. Mo, did you want to go?
Yes, we did a research about skills training programs for immigrants. So when we were doing that mapping of a lot of programs across the country, we did see, there is a focus more on certain programs. For example, the focus is more on language. The programs on, let's say, occupational skills, those are slightly, weaker compared to other types of skills. So we definitely looked at age. So we found that there are less programs supporting like older immigrants. I mean, of course, maybe they're not considered as the main, the core body of the labor force, but that really shouldn't be the excuse, right? So we did find that there is a gap that, a lot of programs are focusing more on supporting, immigrants with a younger age.
Thank you. So this was another question that was addressed to all panelists. I'll pose it to everyone. How can we address the impact of a lack of recognizing foreign credentials on unemployment rates amongst immigrants in Canada? Have you come across research in this area? And I know, Wendy, you had answered in the chat. So I'll give maybe Dorian, I can give this to you to get us started.
Yeah, thank you. So the lack of recognizing foreign credential is a big deal in many in the literature, and then most of the job seekers, they end up trying to find different avenues or different ways to get jobs, and I think this maybe can go by field at some point. Maybe it may make sense based on the conversation I had with some employment service providers. They kind of understand that there may be some. It makes sense that there can be some requirements that some people need for example, becoming a nurse because of the type of the job or responsibilities that they have. So probably it may be a problem that is beyond them at this point. But then for other fields, it's much more easier to go through using the bridging services that are available.
Thank you. Wendy, I know this is an area that is of great interest to you. Is there anything else you want to add to your note?
Yeah, but I mean, certainly the questions about Canadian experience, in spite of being a violation of at least the Human Rights Code in Ontario, still get asked. But I also think, we're doing some research specifically on regulated professions like allied health professionals, nurses, physicians, and so on, because it's such a clear gap in the demand versus the barriers that are put in place, and everyone knows that story. And we found a few things. So some of it is just protectionism by the regulatory bodies. They clearly have set up processes to make it almost impossible to practice. Very often with physicians, for example, they come and they pass all the examinations, but then they have to compete with Canadian-born physicians who have studied in Canada for the internships and the residencies that are required to get their medical licenses. So it's an impossible situation. We see some physicians immigrating to Canada, registering in the United States at the University of Buffalo to do their credentials, getting accredited in the US, and then coming back to Canada because Canada has reciprocal arrangements with the US. So huge problem. And I think some provinces are starting to realize that Canadians are dying because of lack of access to healthcare professionals, and they're trying to loosen things up. The one other point I did want to make is we had a presentation specifically on nurses, and one of the interesting phenomena is the majority of internationally educated nurses coming to Canada are from countries like Africa and countries in the Caribbean, meaning most of them are Black. And I think it's very clear that there are interrelationships between, as Jennifer and others noted, significant interrelationships between, for example, anti-Black racism and barriers that are being put in place for internationally educated professionals that we really have to address.
Thank you. Another question that just came in right now is, this is directed towards you, Jennifer. I'm wondering how we can shift the equity and equality narrative in Canada to avoid a colorblind approach to race within the employment sector. I often hear employers say that they don't see skin color, but see skills, which may sound like a perspective focusing on equality, but may ignore the unique race-based experiences of employees.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that question as well. We had slides that because of, how long the presentation was going to take, we had to take out. We are sad to do so. There was a slide about, during this time of the pandemic, there was also the white majority community was becoming more knowledgeable about, racialized policing and experiences of Black Canadians, including Black newcomers, in terms of dealing with the police and security forces. And so one of the things that we were going to present on was going to be about not only, how did the pandemic impact people's experiences of employment, but how did the Black Lives Matter campaign in 2020, which, to be clear, we understand that the Black Lives Matter protests began much earlier, 6 years earlier, and the findings of that kind of advocacy work much earlier. But what we were saying is that here in Edmonton, there was, 10,000 people came out, which is a lot for Edmonton, came out to support a protest in June. And so what this did was actually catapult the topic of racism in the workplace, and particularly Black Canadian employees' experiences of racism, both in wider society, but in the workplace as well. And so we had participants kind of say, yeah, actually more people are actually willing to talk about racism. And so I think these kind of external events, people, white majority community members, and again, of course, the topic of racism has been talked about forever by those who are racialized, but the white majority community are becoming, they are no longer able to feign ignorance or avoid the conversation. At least that was what we were hearing in 2020 and 2021. But we also have, so respondents were saying, yeah, there is more discussion, but we also had respondents say, yeah, there's been discussion, but no meaningful engagement with this. So the question asks, how can we avoid this colorblind approach? And I think it is the continuation of talking about the importance of addressing racism, to continue understanding that just, a colorblind approach, all it allows the racial status quo to continue. And so I think this, and again, as Dr. Ntungane has been reporting on with regard to having specialized training around this idea that, Canadian workplaces are not neutral spaces, and that they have cultural conventions that incorporate anti-Black racism. And so that we need to address this, both from the employer's side, again, having employers again address what's in their workplace, not just in terms of, okay, let's make all our policies colorblind. No, let's recognize the ways in which anti-Black racism has continued and continues to impact Black employees, Canadians, and newcomers, and their ability to fully engage in the economy and the labor market. Dr. Ntungane, did you want to, or Dr. Kateri, did you want to add to that?
One thing that I can add to that is basically you having, for example, an institution study to collect data and then share publicly data on diversity in their workplace, explain and share their objective, their long-term objective, and then also have from time to time conversations around their progress towards reaching their goal of having a diverse workplace. That can help as well.
Yeah,
I think the other thing that I want to share is also having a workplace that is willing to address issues of racism within between employees and and employers is very, very, very significant. And we know that as a Black person, I have experienced situations where employers don't want to discuss about racism in the workplace. And also holding those who are discriminating Black people because of their color accountable. And employers raising those issues of a non-discrimination in workplace, not coming with a colorblind issues that there is no racism in the workplace. And we know for sure that racism exists in most workplaces is very, very significant.
Thank you. So diving off of that question, and this was, it came through earlier, and I noticed that Wendy, you had answered it already. So I'll paste it in here. I pasted it into the chat. I work with highly educated newcomers who are fluent in English, but speak with an accent. There is unspoken biases in the workplace about competencies of individuals speaking English with an accent, even if they were lucky to get entry-level job. They often are not successful candidates for career advancement opportunities. Dorian or Helen, I don't know if this is something that you want to add to.
Speaking about work accent, I have an accent. I was not born in Canada, but I was educated in a former British colony. So my accent will never be Canadian. That is very, very, very significant. And I'm not sure whether it's because I'm from social work. Social work, we talk about our social location. And in all interviews that I have attended in Canada, even after my PhD, I started with my social location, where I come from and why I speak with an accent. I think it's very, very significant for us to speak about our accent, our non-Canadian accent, and be proud of our non-Canadian accent. Even in the class, when you set your social location to students understand you and they don't come back to ask you, you don't speak with a Canadian accent. If you can understand me now, I think everybody in Canada should be able to speak, to understand me when I open my mouth and speak. The same applies to individuals when they are going through these employment programs. They should be able to say, yes, I am not Canadian, I speak English, and I was educated in Canada. However, I am saying this, but I don't believe most employers get it. Yeah.
I think also they don't get it mainly because of the lack of training, or they have that biasness that really think they don't disconnect the skills and the accent that people have. We speak so many languages, so it's normal that you're gonna have different accents.
Accent, yeah.
Okay, so with about 30 seconds left, I'd like to turn it over to anybody who wants to add any final thoughts or comments. And just to answer the question about will there be a recording of this session? Yes, those will be edited and then posted on the Pathways to Prosperity website and their YouTube channel. And if you want, you can reach out directly to the presenters today for a copy of their slides as well. I know that was one of the questions. Any final thoughts? And if there are none,
Mohammed, there's a great question about self-identification.
oh, did that just come in? I did not see that one.
It's a new one.
Oh, that's a big one at 2:15. So let me pose it. Racialized immigrants applying for jobs are often asked to identify as visible minorities under the Employment Equity Act. Yet hiring biases still exist or persist. Can the panelists discuss their thoughts on this conflict and how to address the issue? I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe Wendy, you want to get the discussion started?
Yeah, I think people don't self-identify if they don't trust the purposes. So the rates of self-identification are actually one of the strongest indicators of inclusion in organizations. And I agree, it's a big problem when people are asked to self-identify in applications, and then that information is not actually used in any significant way. So you have to, if you're going to ask, you have to be prepared to use it. And some organizations are, some are saying that the finalists have to include at least one woman and one, racialized person, or they're setting targets for within the pipeline, not just for hiring. So it can be really important, but many people don't trust the process.
And sorry if I'll just quickly add that it's not only about getting folks in the doors, but also and having that important representation, but also to address the white supremacy within institutions itself. And so looking at really forwarding, if managers are in place, how much racial stamina do they have? And that's a terminology developed by Dr. D'Angelo and Oslam recently, talking about, are these managers willing to self-reflect, to position themselves and to address the whiteness that's at work in their workplaces? So it's about creating and removing the colorblind racist approach and addressing the racism that's within. And so that can, again, more and more training is required. And I think that's we're all in there.
Thank you. Anybody else who wanted to address the identity question, Dorian or Helen?
I would say it's the same thing. It's there is a need of accountability, I think, even if we give this data about how you identify yourself. So most of the time it's because we don't know how this is going to be used. So based on past experiences, some people have been hurt by that, giving that out, this information. So again, keeping institutions and companies accountable and then training them more will help, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that covers the session today. I'd like to thank the panelists, and I'd like to thank Pathways to Prosperity for putting on this series. Please reach out to any of the panelists should you have any questions and opportunity for further discussion. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the afternoon.